Good afternoon. On behalf of the European Society for Cell and Gene Therapy meeting and the local organizing committee, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here in Helsinki to this annual meeting of our society. We've been in Finland some years ago and we are very happy to be back here. I will let Seppo present you the whole program, but just before that I want to spend 1 minute to thank very warmly Seppo and the local organizing committee, who has worked a lot during all this year to build a very interesting program with the board members and also with the help of our partners from Watson. You know that there have been many very important progresses in the field of gene and cell therapy, and very hot topics you will hear about, so I think you will have a very good meeting. I wish to thank very warmly our sponsors, without whom you know that nothing would never happen. And finally, I wish to thank you, all of you, for being here today. I know that it's a little earlier than what we usually do doing the meeting in September, so I wish to really thank you for being there today, even with this schedule. So have a very good meeting and enjoy.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. And also from my behalf, welcome to Helsinki, welcome to Finland, to this European Society of Gene and Cell Therapy meeting, which is organized together with Finnish Society of Gene Therapy. And before we go into the real main science topic for this opening session, I thought that I'll show you a few slides, because many people have asked me, where is this picture coming from? But before going there, I would also like to thank from local organizing committee all the sponsors. The sponsoring has been very successful this year, and the meeting will be well on its way and successful. So thank you very much. Without this support, this type of event would not be possible. But this painting, what is it? Well, there is a Finnish epic poetry collection collected some 150, 180 years ago, called Kalevala. It means land of Kaleva, or land of Eastern Finland and Karelia, that is now on the Russian side. It's based on the folklore and mythology. It describes world, life, society in 50 songs, and they have plenty of verses. It's somewhat similar to the Iliad, Beowulf, or Nibelungen Lied. So there is some commonality in these folklore songs. And it's a rich source, an idea, an inspiration for Finnish artists, many of them. Sibelius, Akseli Kalenkallila, who has been the painter. But Sampo, what is this? The painting name is Defense of Sampo, so defending something. The Sampo is a magic machine, source of wealth. It's like a world mill created by blacksmith Seppo Ilmarinen, who was in the Kalevala in those times, the guy who also created sky, stars, moon, other key elements on the earth. And this Sampo created flour, salt, gold out of thin air and brought good fortune to its holder. In this painting, the forging of the Sampo is described, so that it's made from metal, I believe. But like in every good story, something dramatic happens, and this Sampo was stolen. What did Finns do? Well, they went back and then took the Sampo back, and this defense, this painting describes the defense. Who had the Sampo was Mistress of North, a mysterious evil lady, even further north where we are. And now she, with magic powers, came back as a bird with fighters, and they are attacking the Finnish heroes. But why did I take this? Let's think about gene and cell therapy. This also should give us potentially richness. It could be very rich source of prosperity to the mankind. And we need to defend it among colleagues, critics, markets, regulators. So there is some similarity. I don't say who is this one out of that list, but you may guess who I think that might be. But even more interesting is that in this folklore, there is actually idea of regenerative medicine that many of us are doing with cell therapies. Actually, here is a very famous painting showing mother on the banks of the river of Tuonela, which is river of death. This warrior was hunting the swan of the death, who swims on the river of death. And obviously he was killed and ripped into several pieces and thrown into the river. So mother realized what's happening, and mother collects the pieces scattered into the river of death and puts his son back again into one piece and brings him back into the life. So there is actually some idea of regenerative medicine in this ancient folklore. And even better, the regulatory issues are covered, because this Kalevala with its songs has actually a very specific repeated rhythm, 5/4. It's called trochai tetrameter. It goes very like a train. And what is even more interesting is that it has a feature called parallelism. Idea presented in the previous line of the songs is repeated immediately after that line, rather than moving straight forward in the story. So actually, findings are repeated and validated. So that idea came already 200 years ago in Finnish poetry. This actually, Kalevala has painted several of the key Finnish paintings, and if you're interested in, you can see them in the National Museum in Helsinki. This guy was also quite well known in Europe, and for example, he made a portrait of Louis Pasteur, which is now in Museum of Orsay, and he also painted like young Sibelius. These guys were having parties in a restaurant where we have the speakers' dinner. So, welcome to Helsinki. This was just some light program start, and now it's time to really move to the real science, and we have a great pleasure to have Professor Stefan Hell from Max Planck Institute. He doesn't need any introduction anymore, as you all know that he won last year the Nobel Prize for his seminal inventions in microscopy. So please, Professor Hell.
Well, thank you very much, Seppo, for the kind introduction, and of course for having me here to give this opening lecture. I mean, Seppo actually nicely exemplified it. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and you can explain and understand many things with a picture. And this not only applies, I think, to our daily lives, it definitely applies to sciences, because it's probably not just coincidental. Yeah, the beginning of the natural science, of the life sciences as we know them today, very much coincides in time, in history, actually, with the invention of the light microscope. Because with light microscopy, mankind was able to see for the first time that every living being consists of cells as basic units of structure and function. Of course, bacteria were discovered, subcellular organelles, and so on. However, I'm sure you will remember your school days or university days where you learned that the resolution of a light microscope is fundamentally limited to about half the wavelengths of light, which typically amounts to about 200 nanometers. And if you want to see smaller things, you have to resort to electron microscopy. Now, there's no doubt about the fact that electron microscopy provides a much higher spatial resolution, but it's also not a big secret, I think also in this community, that the light microscope still remains the most popular imaging modality in the life sciences. I made a little experiment to highlight that, to make this very visual. I've counted here in this journal the number of studies that use the light microscope and those that use an electron microscope, and you can see which of the two won. And this is very representative, and it has two strong reasons, the popularity of the light microscope. Now, the first reason is that it's the only way by which you can look into living cells in 3 dimensions with minimal invasion. That's number one. But there's also another reason. We have, if you want to understand what's going on in a cell at a molecular level, we have to highlight the molecules that we want to see, for example, the proteins. And that is possible, as we all know, relatively easily in a light microscope by attaching a fluorescent label to it, a fluorophore, for example, or by expressing a fluorescent protein and so on. So in simple terms, by adding very specifically a fluorophore that has an energy ground state, which is actually shown in here, an energy excited state, of course, we can make these molecules glow. For example, if we shine green light on them, they will be raised, these molecules, to the higher lying state here. And then they will last for a little while, wiggle their atoms a bit, and then the molecules come down to the ground state by emitting a fluorescent photon. And then we see the protein of interest through the fluorescence that is actually generated by the label that marks that protein very, very specifically. Now, because there is a shift in wavelength, say green excitation light and orange emission, fluorescence microscopy is extremely sensitive. In fact, it is so sensitive that you can detect even a single molecule in the bulk of a cell, because it can easily separate out the illumination light from the fluorescent light. It's very easy to do that. So you can detect single molecules, as one of my colorists has shown. But once a second molecule, a third molecule, a fourth molecule comes very close to the first, closer than the 200 nanometers, then it's not possible to tell them apart. So in other words, it's very important to realize that resolution is not about sensitivity. Resolution is about the ability to distinguish things, to discern things at small scale, to see details and structures and so on. And therefore, it's very obvious that even in a fluorescence microscope, despite its sensitivity, a lot of information is lost. And so if you manage to overcome this diffraction barrier and come up with a light microscope that has the spatial resolution, the resolving power, the ability to discern small things, here at the nanometer scale, then we would get much more information. Now, overcoming this barrier is easier, of course, said than done. But of course, if you want to tackle this problem, you have to understand it first. I'm trying to explain this in a very simple way, which is actually the most profound way of explaining the diffraction barrier, the resolution barrier in a light microscope. Now, the most important element of a light microscope is the objective lens. And the role of this objective lens is nothing but to concentrate the light in space, as you can see in here. So focus the light down to a point. But because light propagates as a wave, as we all know from our basic physics education, it's not possible for the lens to concentrate the light on a single point, like here, as I'm showing here with my laser pointer. Rather, we'll get a blob of light that will be smeared out here in the focal region. So we'll have a minimum spatial extent. And that minimum spatial extent is at least about 200 nanometers in the focal plane and about 500 nanometers along the optic axis. And this blurring of the light in the focal region has a major consequence. All the features that fall within this range, these little dots here, say these are molecules, will be flooded at the same time with the illumination light, no way out. And because they are flooded at the same time with this illumination light, they will also fluoresce at the same time, so to speak, simultaneously. So if you collect the fluorescence light and project it here onto a detector, it's very obvious that each of these little, say, molecules, for example, will also produce a blob of light in here, because here the light is also focused when it goes back, and then the neighboring one will also produce a blob of light. And as you can see, all these molecules producing this blob of light cannot be distinguished because the blobs here overlap strongly in space. And so no matter what detector we placed in here, say a photomultiplier, the eye, or even a camera, we will not be able to tell these molecules apart or these features apart because they all produce light in here. Now, the person who realized this problem very early on was this man, Ernst Abbe, who lived at the end of the 19th century in Germany, and he coined this diffraction barrier in an equation that is still named after him. It's basically saying that in order to be separable in a light microscope, two features of the same kind have to be further away than the wavelengths divided by this number, which is actually twice the numerical aperture of the objective lens. This is something like 2 or 3, and it's something like 600, 700, or 500 nanometers, and this is how you end up with the 200 nanometers. Now, you can find this equation basically in any textbook of physics, optics, and also cell biology, of course. And not only there, you will also find it on a memorial that was erected in honor of Ernst Abbe in Jena, in Germany, where he lived and worked. And there you will find this equation written in stone. And this is actually what we had to beat in order to come up with sharper pictures. And this was accepted throughout the 20th century. It was very well accepted. And not only that, it also was a fact. So when I was a student in physics at the end of the 80s in Heidelberg, this was the best resolution that you could get at that time with a light focusing microscope. It's done in a confocal mode, which is slightly better, minimally better than the standard epifluorescence microscope. Now you can easily take pictures which look like this, so they have a much higher spatial resolution with a method that I have developed together with my people in my group. It's called STED microscopy. So obviously, it's possible to overcome the diffraction barrier. And of course, this overcoming of the diffraction barrier has or had a number of consequences in the art of microscopy and, of course, in all the areas where light microscopy is relevant. Now, one of the consequences it had for me actually last year was that I had the privilege of meeting kings from Nordic countries. First, the king of Norway. So I received a prize actually with a scroll and a nice medal. And a few weeks later, I was informed that I would also have the privilege of meeting the king of Sweden, also with a nice scroll and a medal, followed by a fantastic banquet with excellent food, I must say, and very nice company. But I believe you're not interested in the gossip. You really want to know how this diffraction barrier has been overcome. So I'll concentrate on that. So how can we now overcome this barrier? And so what is the story actually behind the story? Now, I think that every discovery in science, maybe not every, but many, many discoveries in science, they have also a personal story behind it. And my personal story is the following. Actually, I was born here in the western part of Romania, which you will not be able to tell from my name because I have a German background. This was at that time, in the early 20th century, still a part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. But realizing that there is not much future in this country, I decided to convince my parents to move to West Germany, which eventually worked. And so we settled here in Ludwigshafen in 1978, and then after 2 years of high school, I went to Heidelberg to study physics, because I always wanted to study physics. Now this was fun, and of course, like most physics students at that time, and perhaps even today, I was interested in very basic things, like quantum mechanics, quantum electrodynamics, very fundamental things. But at some point, I must say, I lost courage, simply because not having a strong social background, and my father was threatened with unemployment and these kind of things, I said, okay, you have to do something very applied that gives you a job in the end. And so microscopy was something that was very applied, that could be used, for example, in computer chips inspection. And so I actually embarked with a professor who had a startup company developing confocal microscopy for computer chip inspection and so on. And then I got bored. It was terrible at that time. So this is what I looked like at that time, believe it or not. And I said, this is not why I studied physics. This is totally applied, and optics, this is the physics of the 19th century. There's nothing special about it. You cannot be creative or come up with something interesting. Then I had two options. Either option number one was misery. The second option was to think whether there's still a problem left. And so the problem that was left in this old art of microscopy was to break the diffraction barrier. So if I could come up with something that would surmount a diffraction barrier, that would be really cool and worthwhile doing, and that would be basic enough to be fascinating. And so I thought about that, and of course, you just have to have a philosophy. So why did I believe that in the end this should be possible? Well, I realized that changing the way the light is focused won't work. Abe was right in many regards, that this is not the way to go, most likely. But I thought to myself, so much physics was invented or discovered in the 20th century, and molecular spectroscopy and all these things. There must be at least one physical phenomenon that gets us beyond the diffraction barrier. I have to find the right one. Maybe there is one, or there should be one, that would get me beyond the barrier. And so at some point, I put it down in writing. So either exploiting the properties of the flow force, if you do fluorescence imaging, just check out the states of the flow force, or maybe there's a quantum optical effect to do it, and then it should be possible to overcome this diffraction barrier. So that was the idea. But of course, in the end, you have to have something concrete. I tried to actually settle in Germany academically or find a stipend or something to continue to work, but it didn't work. I was lucky that I happened to meet a person, a professor here in Finland, and he invited me to come to Turku, not very far from here, to pursue this idea. And so I went in the 90s, early 90s to Turku, and there, of course, I brought my philosophy with me, and one Saturday morning, in fact, I opened this textbook, which was a quantum optics textbook, at this page, and came across a phenomenon that I was familiar with, but then all of a sudden, I realized this could be the way to go. I saw this phenomenon of stimulated emission, and I was totally excited. Instantly went back to the lab in Turku and made some calculations, and I felt this could be the way to go. So why was I so excited? I'm going back to the problem. You see, here's the lens, and here's the blob of light. And as I explained, all the features here are forced to produce fluorescence at the same time, here at the detector, at the backside of the lens. And this is why we cannot separate the features. So we cannot change the fact that all of the molecules here are flooded with light, no way out. But what if we manage to put some molecules here into a state in which they are not able to produce light at the detector? So in other words, if we manage to put molecules into a dark state in which they are not glowing light, and then, of course, we can separate the bright ones from the dark ones. We just have to create two classes of molecules, bright ones and dark ones, and then we can tell them apart. So in other words, for example, we would here be able to see just the signal from that one because those are in a dark state. Or this is the top view of the focal spot. If you manage to keep those dark, we see just this molecule. So the idea is, as I said, not to change the way the light is focused. That's very hard to do. But keep the molecules in a dark state, at least some molecules for a short period of time to tell them apart. And now you will say, okay, are there such things as dark states in a molecule if I'm doing just normal fluorescence microscopy? Now look at the energy diagram. We have here the ground state and we have here the excited state. And as I explained, the excited state is actually the fluorescent state because in order to fluoresce, the molecule has to be in excited state. Only from here it can emit fluorescent photon. If the molecule is in the ground state, it cannot emit a fluorescent photon, it is dark. So yes, there is a dark state in the fluorophore that is the ground state. And so the ground state is actually a dark state. And now you see why I was so excited. I realized that stimulated emission, this phenomenon, is a way to make dark state molecules. And so I was excited because I had found a way to make molecules dark for a short period of time and to create two classes of molecules, bright molecules and dark molecules, in order to make sure that not all of them produce signal here at the detector. And now you can imagine how this microscope worked, which I dubbed the STED microscope in those days. Here there is a scheme, there is a lens, there is a sample, that's very normal, there is a detector. We also have light for turning molecules on, so produce excited state molecules from the ground state to the excited state. And of course, this is the top view of the sample. Is the spot of excitation or illumination light here on the sample. And of course, all the molecules that fall within that range will produce signal here at the detector. That's very obvious. And so the resolution will not be better than what we have here, given by this extent of this green spot of light. But now, and that's the point, we use a second beam of light that makes molecules assume the ground state, the dark state. So this one pushes the molecule from the dark to the bright state. and the red beam does the opposite, pushes the molecules from the bright state back down to the dark state. So it turns them off. And so this beam of light pushes the molecule down to the ground state. It's a very basic phenomenon in physics. Every physics student first year learns about making molecules dark with this phenomenon of stimulated emission. And so it has just not been noticed because nobody thought about the resolution in those days. And now the condition is that we have to have a redshifted beam of light, so it's lower energy photons. This beam does not excite molecules because the photon energy is not enough. It's not green, it's red. That's one of the conditions that we have now in order to make sure that the molecule is turned off. And there is another condition, which is very simple, equally trivial. Of course, you have to make sure that if the molecule is excited and assumes here this bright state, then there must be a red photon that kicks it down. In other words, if this red beam is very weak, then of course the molecule will not be pushed down to the ground state because there is no photon that does it. But once you have a certain intensity of the red beam, a certain value, then you can be sure that there is always a red photon at the molecule that kicks it down. And this is actually shown in here. So this is the probability of the fluorescent molecule to emit light, to assume the on state, so to speak, in the presence of the red beam. So this is the intensity of the red beam shown in here, and this is the ability of the molecule to fluoresce. And once you have an intensity that is higher than this threshold, I'm putting this threshold in here arbitrarily, then basically the molecule is not able to assume this state because as soon as it gets up, it's instantly pushed back down. So you can say, in simple terms, the molecule is turned off. And so you can have as much green light as you want. Once this beam is brighter than this threshold here, the molecule is turned off. And then it's staying dark and cannot produce any signal here at the detector. Of course, in this scheme, it does make sense to turn off all the molecules. So we do not focus the light onto another blob of light, another red blob of light. We modify the beam, the red beam, such that it produces a ring. Not a big deal. A piece of glass that is placed here in this beam just converts the beam into a ring. And then we have excitation here, and here we have de-excitation. Here we turn the molecules on, and here we turn the molecules off. And now let's assume we want to see only the signal here from the center. Just the molecules from that fiber. What do we have to do? Well, we have to turn off those molecules, and that is easily done just by making this ring, or the intensity in this ring, bright enough, such that in absolute terms, in absolute values of intensity, the beam here is stronger than the threshold. So in other words, you cannot make the ring as such smaller, but that's not needed. The only thing we have to do is we have to make the intensity brighter such that even in the weaker part, it is beyond the threshold, and then we have turned the molecules off. So ideally, here in the center, the red beam is 0, the intensity is 0, and here it has a value that is 20% of its maximum or so. But if it's bright enough, in absolute terms, beyond the threshold, all the molecules are turned off, and only those molecules here are capable of producing signal here at the detector. And now we can separate features. Why? Because adjacent molecules, of course, are forced to emit sequentially. Okay, in this way we will tell them apart. A formal way of explaining it is to say we actually prepare the molecules that reside here within this zone in two different states. I'm removing the donut now just to make this clear. So here the molecules here in this diffraction zone are in two different states. At the other part, they're forced to stay in the ground state because as soon as they get up, they're instantly pushed back down. So those are constantly in the ground state. Whereas in here, they can be in the excited state. And because they are in two different states, we can tell the molecules apart. And then it's possible to separate the features. Now, this idea I published back then in '94 when I was here, actually in Turku, in Finland. And so you may say, okay, so everyone said, oh, wow, wonderful, great idea, go ahead and do it. But that was not the case. It was met with disbelief. Actually, no one believed in that, probably because so many people failed in overcoming the diffraction barrier. It was not very easy to survive for about 3-4 years, I must say. And, but I was happy. That's also another part of it. I spent one of the best time of my scientific life, actually, here in Finland, because I worked on a fascinating problem, and I could do what I wanted to do, and this kept me going, of course. And eventually somebody has to give you the opportunities to do it, and after meandering around, including to the United Kingdom, I ended up in Göttingen, where I'm still now. And there, eventually, I got the money to try it out at the Max Planck Institute for Biophysical Chemistry. And now we see that after some development, it worked. So this is a standard, say, confocal recording of something that you cannot really see, and this is now the counterpart with this method, STAT. And now you see that these are nuclear pore complexes from the, say, nuclear envelope of a cell. And you can zoom in here, and you see that there's an 8-fold symmetry in the nuclear pore complex. If you make a comparison with high-end confocal microscopy, actually there's hardly any comparison. And so there's a substantial gain in spatial resolution, in this case, roughly by an order of magnitude. So it turned out that this idea was correct and turned out to work. Now, if you have, of course, a substantial gain in spatial resolution, then you can apply, then you can learn something. I'm just selecting a few applications. There are many by now, and so there's a lot of literature on that. And not being a life scientist per se, I'm just highlighting a few. So this is a collaboration actually with a virologist in Heidelberg, where at the German Cancer Research Center I have another small group. So confocally, if you try to image a virus, of course, then the virus, of course, is much smaller than the diffraction barrier. You always get a blob of light. You don't see anything. So here, what was actually done is a certain protein called ENF, which is sitting on HIV, on the envelope of this virus, is labeled. And then, of course, you see the signal from this protein, but you have no clue how this protein is distributed here on the virus. It could be all in one place, or it could be scattered around. No way to resolve it, of course. But by applying, in this case, STAT microscopy, so subdiffraction resolution imaging methodology, we could see that there are different patterns actually formed by this ENF protein, and the mature ones, so those that are ready to infect the next cell, have their ENF proteins in a single place. There are about 7 to 14 copies of this protein ENF on an HIV particle. Now, that's just an example. And I think virology is going to be a very, very important field of application, because these viruses are 30 to 150 nanometers in size, and if you can zoom in and sort out the protein distribution and see dynamics even, this will have an impact. Now, this is another example where we imaged synaptic vesicles in an axon of living hippocampal neurons. This is now confocal after some deconvolution. Doesn't look very nice. But here you have a video rate STAT recording, and you can follow the movement of the synaptic vesicles over time and study them. So this is a relatively early recording of dynamics in a living cell. Now, lifestyle imaging at the extreme is, of course, if you go straight to the system. And one, application we did is we checked out whether we can look into the brain, or at least into the upper layer of the brain of a mouse. And this was actually a transgenic mouse, anesthetized mouse, and some of its neurons expressed the yellow fluorescent protein as a marker. And then we imaged them. So just by opening the skull and putting the objective lens onto the skull of the mouse, and because it's fluorescence microscopy, you can take sequences of images, and so this is a sequential recording, a movie, so to speak, done in minutes of intervals. And you can see that actually the brain is slightly changing, or the structures in the brain are slightly moving. So these are dendritic spines, so this is a stretch of a dendrite, and this is nicely actually visualized here. So this is a magnified view of this area. So this has been seen as a result of the high spatial resolution, because you need resolution on the order of 50, 60 nanometers in order to see these little details in here. And the resolution is roughly 3 to 4 times better than the best confocal or 2-photon or whatever. Now, this is interesting because it shows that eventually one will be able to image the protein straight in here. I'm very confident about that, even in anesthetized mouse. So maybe one gives a visual cue to the mouse and sees what's going on in the synapse. So there's a lot of potential now. Say 20 years back, people would have said, this is totally inconceivable because the physics is not there, or the physical chemistry is not there. But the answer is, it is there. It's just a matter of engineering and sorting out little problems, and eventually it will work. So this is just a 3D rendition of dendritic stretch, again, this is actin actually in a neuron taken from excised brain in this case of, it's a living excised brain. Okay, now with that I'm coming back to the resolution. And so the question comes up, what kind of resolution can we get now with this method? Or if the barrier is now broken, what does it mean? Is it just shifted or has it completely disappeared? Now, being a physicist, of course, I had to answer this question. And without going too much into the details, I will answer the question now in very simple terms. Now, as you will appreciate, the resolution will be given largely by the extent of the region in which the molecule is still allowed to emit light. And the smaller this region gets, the higher the resolution will be, because then we can separate features that are closer together. And so it's very obvious that Abbe's equation cannot describe the situation anymore. As a matter of fact, the resolution will be given actually by the extent here in which the molecule is still allowed to assume the bright state, where the molecule is not shut off, so to speak. And this will depend actually on the ratio of the intensity maximum here of the donut and this threshold intensity. Because this threshold intensity, as I explained, moves in towards the center of that say, red spot. And so this ratio here will be decisive. So not the intensity in absolute terms, but the ratio will be decisive, and it must be in the denominator. Because the larger this ratio gets, the smaller d will be. In fact, it scales with the square root of this ratio. And so you see that with little mathematics, that if this becomes very large, this number, then d goes down to 0, because if this becomes 10, 1,000, 10,000, and so on, d will eventually go down to 0. So what does this mean, 0? Well, 0 is not to be taken literally, but almost. Why? If you have two molecules in here, in this region here, d, of course we cannot separate them. Why? Because they are capable of emitting light at the same time. Very clear. But if we make that d even smaller, so that only one molecule fits in, then of course we can separate two molecules, although they are conceptually at molecular distance. Why? Because we force the molecules to emit sequentially, because we do not allow them to assume the on state at the same time. And so the emitting state at the same time, and so we can separate them. So conceptually, the limit of resolution is just the molecule itself. It's very simple. We can conceptually have molecular scale resolution. That's very clear. So that's a paradigm change. Now, with typical organic fluorophores like the GFPs and there are very many variants, or so with typical organic dyes like rhodamines, coumarines, or whatever you have, you are not there, at least not in a general case. The resolution is practically determined in the end by the number of on-off cycles then that you can go. That's in the first place the most limiting factor, or the number of photons that you can get. And so typically you get something between 15 and 25 nanometers. Under lifestyle conditions, I would say 50 nanometers is more the standard, although it's, for a number of cases, always better. What determines the case? The fluorophore. It's very clear, because we separate by fluorophores and fluorophore states, and therefore the fluorophore is decisive. Now, there are fluorophores. They are not ready for being used as markers right now, but they are very, very good as fluorophores. These are not organic ones. These are so-called color senders in diamond crystals, actually. And these are little defects that fluoresce. You can shine light on them, and then they fluoresce forever. There's no photo-bleaching. You can turn them on and off as many times as you want. And with those, we managed to demonstrate very small regions going down to, say, a few nanometers in dimension, just to show that this development is going on. And the state of resolution that we have now in practice doesn't mean that this is going to stay forever. This will get better. We are now in a stage where perhaps MRI was 20 years back. So this is going to be much better than what we have now. There are also applications for this type of things, but this may be not that interesting for you. I'm coming back to the basics again, showing you where this field is actually going to, so that you have an idea. Now, as I explained, the name of the game is play on-off with the molecule. That's really the name of the game. That's it. That's, in simple terms, the whole story. And stat microscopy was the first concept that played this game and was the first to demonstrate that you can cross the barrier. And it's not surprising in retrospect that it was the first, because it uses this basic ground state and this basic excited state, and these are the most basic on-off transitions in a dye that you can imagine. Exciting and de-exciting. As I said, every student, physics student, first year learns about this. But the fact that this is fundamental or very general applies to any fluorophore doesn't mean that it's the best in all cases. So that's clear. And so even back then, when I was in Finland, in Turku in those days, in '94, I realized, since the name of the game is on-off, there must also be other types of states and state transitions that will lead to the same end. For example, you can pump the molecule to a metastable dark state, and then you also have an on-off transition, or you can play cyst runs with fluorophores, if you remember some of your chemistry lectures. And then in the trans state of the molecules are not capable of emitting light, but in the cyst they are, and then you play on-off with a relocation of an atom. And so, in principle, you can use many ways of playing on-off. And so you may ask, so why do we need those? So why do I think about those now that we have those very basic ones? The answer is very simple. Don't forget, we separate by on and off, on and off. Here, if you look at the situation here, the excited state, the fluorescent state, lives only for about a nanosecond. So after a nanosecond, this on-off difference that I critically need to separate the features has disappeared. It disappears after a nanosecond. So I have to act very quickly, creating this difference in states and also telling these features apart. And so if I'm resorting to these states, I have more time, microsecond, millisecond. So it's on and the neighbor is off and it stays there for a millisecond. So I have time to create it and time to read it out. So in other words, the intensity requirement goes down with the lifetime of the states involved. And so that's the big advantage of using such states like cyst runs and so on, because they require fewer photons per unit time, so they require low intensity. So this intensity threshold for turning molecules off, for example, scales down by orders of magnitude just by resorting to other state transitions. And this means here in the equation that you can break the diffraction barrier at much lower light levels. Okay, now this one was very exciting. So when I realized that back in 2003 that there are switchable fluorescent proteins, so I was totally excited. I couldn't have called it STAT anymore because there's no stimulated emissions. I had to give it a different name. I called it resolved. And now you see that genetically encoding a marker and then getting low light level images is very, very appealing. It took us some time to demonstrate it and to make it work because we needed molecules that can be turned on and off many times. But to cut a long story short, eventually we managed, and we have now fluorescent protein that can be switched many times. And then at low light levels, then you can use, of course, many donuts because you don't need much light. So you take a CW laser, like something like this pointer, so spread it out over a large field of view, producing many, many, many donuts. And then you can parallelize the imaging process just by having many of them, image everything onto a camera. For each scanning step, the camera is read out, but you always know that a signal comes from here and from here and from here. And since these are further away than the diffraction barrier, you don't have to worry about the fact that these are many, because they're always separable in the camera. So 10 steps in this direction, 10 steps in that direction gives you a whole field of view quickly. And this has been done in here. So here, within 2 seconds, this picture was taken. Why? Because we used more than 100,000 donuts at the same time. And so this shows you that it's actually the state transition and the molecules that matters. It's actually the molecules that are decisive. It's not the lens anymore. Now, this is what it looked like, STAT microscopy in the early stages when we had to find it out. Meanwhile, you can buy it. So I have a startup, I have to make a disclaimer, which actually recorded this picture, and this made it actually on the official poster. As I said, STAT was the first concept that worked according to this principle and was demonstrated. It was used and done in a different way, also by 2 American colleagues, actually by this for the first time, playing on-off. Here, the on-off was played in a single molecule level. So it's the same separation principle, but the on-off was done on a single molecule level, and this has been named Palm or Storm. And so this is the 2 colleagues with whom I'm sharing the award in Stockholm. So with that, I'm coming basically to the end. And I'm asking the question, what does it take to get the best spatial resolution? Now, if you had asked me this, or others, 20 years back, the answer would have been, well, it takes good lenses, very obvious, because the separation of features is done by the focusing of light. And the better I can focus the light here or there, the better the resolution will be. So it's all hinged on, actually, on the lenses. And this is, of course, limited by diffraction. If you separate by the focusing of light, you will not be able to separate features that are closer together than what is here given by the spot of light. So what was the solution in the end? Third problem, the solution was not to separate by focusing of light, or just by the focusing of light, but to separate by placing the molecules that you look at in two different states. In the simplest case, on and off. And here is just a selection of states that has been used to demonstrate that you can do it. And this is the actual, the fundamentals of it. And so what I've explained is that we use a pattern of light to determine where the molecule is on and where the molecule is off, like the donut, okay? So we, in this concept STED and resolved and so on, we can tightly control, actually, where the molecule is on and where the molecule is off. We don't need to find it out here. We can use here any detector, camera, photomultiplier, because we know exactly where the signal comes from. And so we control the occupation of the state within this diffraction zone. Now, the method PALM that I mentioned, done actually by these American colleagues here, actually by 3 groups almost in parallel. And it differs from this one by the fact that only one molecule is turned on, the rest is kept off, and you flood everything, but only this one is emitting light, and this is done totally stochastically. Purely stochastically, randomly at some point, just one molecule. Now, if it's done randomly, of course, then you ask, okay, how do I know which one has been turned on or where the molecule is located? Now, under the condition, and that's a provision here, under the condition that the molecule emits many photons in a bunch from if it's turned on, you can produce a pattern of light in here, which is critical, because again, you need a pattern of light to find out where it is. You can calculate the centroid of the pattern of light that is produced in here to find out where the molecule went on. And so you get a position here from the emitted light, whereas in here, you get a position from the light that falls on the molecule. So this is the difference. You always need many photons to determine the position. So here you need many photons here, and here you need many photons at the back. So that's the point. But the separation, and this is really critical, the separation of the features is always done by an on-off transition. So this is on and the rest is off, and this is why we can separate it. Again, these are on, the rest are off, this is why we can separate it. So the on-off is actually the key of the whole story. And fluorescent, non-fluorescent is just the beginning. So this is not the end of it. I mean, you can, in principle, expand it also to other type of contrast modalities. So this has just begun. So in the 20th century, as I said, it was the lenses that were decisive. But now it's not the lenses, it's the molecules. So the molecules really determine the resolution, they determine the speed of imaging, they determine the contrast. It has become a chemistry problem, so to speak. The physics problem has been converted into a chemistry problem. And as I said, you can also imagine other types of contrast modalities like absorption and non-absorption if one managed to find the right pairs of state. With that, I'm acknowledging the people who have contributed to this development. Some of them have left the labs, and several of them have become independent and professors themselves. Some are continuing actually in the lab. We've had a lot of fun, and with that, I'm coming actually to this slide. What do we have to do with the equation? No problem. I mean, just plug in the square root factor, and now the good news is that we can have a spatial resolution that goes down to the molecular scale. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, why can we separate here the fibers in here, but here we can't? It's very simple. At the time the molecules were on here, here they were off. And at the time they were off here, they were on the other side. It's really that simple. So sometimes a seemingly unsolvable problem, scientific problem, can have a very, very simple solution. And with that, I'm basically at the end. But since this is an evening lecture, and I felt that I can give you maybe, and it's actually the first time that I'm speaking here publicly in Helsinki after the Nobel Prize. I said I can give you perhaps an impression of the banquet speech that I gave in Stockholm, which kind of summarizing the philosophy that I've been trying to put forth here, actually in this lecture. And so I'm just using the 3 minutes to show you actually what I've said at the banquet speech.
Your Royal Highnesses, ladies and gentlemen, what a week, what a day, and what a night. I cannot imagine anything more exhilarating than to stand here this evening, also on behalf of my colleagues W.E. Myrna and Eric Betzig, thanking the Swedish Academy and the Nobel Foundation for the honor that has been bestowed upon us. We are so grateful to all who have supported us on our path, and above all, we feel very, very humbled. Like all laureates, each of us three has his own road to this magnificent hall. Our personal stories have been quite different. Yet, we have much in common: passion for what we do and fascination with things that cannot be done, or, let's say, things that cannot be done, supposedly. Erwin Schrödinger, who spoke at his banquet 81 years ago tonight, wrote, "It is fair to state that we are not going to experiment with single particles anymore, then we will raise dinosaurs in the zoo." Well, one of us, W.E., discovered just the opposite. Single molecules can indeed be seen and played with individually. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what do we learn from this? First, Erwin Schrödinger would never have gone on to write Jurassic Park. Second, as a Nobel laureate, you should say, this or that is never going to happen, because you will increase your chances tremendously of being remembered decades later in a Nobel banquet speech. And so, on to super-resolution fluorescence imaging. According to the belief, molecules closer together than 200 nanometers could not be told apart with focused light. This is because in a packed molecular crowd, the molecules shout out their fluorescence simultaneously, causing their voices to be confused. But believe it or not, Eric found a way to discern the molecules by calling on each one of them individually using a microscope so simple that he built it with a friend in his living room. As for myself, I never had that kind of patience, calling on each molecule one by one. No way. I just told all of them to be quiet, except for a selected few. Just keep the molecules quiet and let only a few speak up. A simple solution to a supposedly unsolvable problem. It made the resolution limit history. Now have a guess, where did this idea occur to me? Not very far from here, actually, in a student dorm in Finnish Åbo, in what you may kindly call a living room. So, what does it take, ladies and gentlemen, to end up standing here telling you a story of important discoveries or improvements? Well, you definitely need a living room. At the very least, you need a place to sleep. And when you fall asleep, you may forget that others consider you too daring or too foolish. But when morning comes, you would better find yourself saying, I have so many choices of what to do or what to leave every morning, every day. I better judge for myself and go ahead and do it. Because nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come, even if it came in a living room or to someone with a humble living. And if you feel we'll never raise dinosaurs, who knows? One day, someone may be actually standing here giving a banquet speech. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us embrace a culture that addresses problems deemed impossible to solve, and let us now honor those who will do so with a toast. Skål.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you so much for this beautiful intervention. Do you have questions? Difficult, huh?
It's a big hall.
Maybe I can start. You know that we are trying to do changes in DNA, gene surgery, and we would be very interested in seeing interactions, molecule on DNA and the kinetics or the diffusion or interaction. So how far are we from that point based on your physics view? From that?
I think in many cases it's just a matter of doing it. So if you can label it, I think that's the biggest challenge right now. It's not so much the technique as such, it's the labeling. You have to be able to label it in a way that the functionality stays, that's very important, and that the label is of course bright enough. But once you have those two conditions, you can apply it actually to every area in which fluorescence microscopy has been used. So to give you a rule of thumb, I mean, if you can take a confocal picture of something, there is no reason why you should not try out a method such as that. Or if you can follow, say, individual molecules, there's no reason why you should not do it in an on-off switching mode so that you can see molecules that would blur everything sequentially. And another point that has not maybe come across so well is that these techniques, and especially stat microscopy, have become not only cheaper, so it's now standard price tags that you can get, but they are readily applicable. So by now there are push-button systems where you push a button and basically get a picture. And this was not the case a couple of years back. This has also something to do with the basic patent has expired, and so several companies are now on the market and competing each other, and that of course pushes the development. So in many cases it's just a matter of trying it out. And the hurdle is not so much the microscope as such, it's the labeling. The labeling is the key, because this resolution and is done with the fluorophores. The fluorophores determine actually what you're going to see, how much you're going to see.
Okay, like the transgene could be labeled, or the nucleotides, and then
Sure.
you would be able to see. Thank you. There is one question, please, up there.
Yeah, excellent talk and motivational as well. So I have a question. The nuclear pore complex you showed is really nice work. There's an argument that HIV, when it gets to the nuclear complex, it gets stuck there. That's the notion, that it's bigger than
Right.
the actual complex. Is there a way to resolve using two different dyes, sort of the virus being stuck there?
Yeah.
If that's true, we don't really know.
Yeah.
Would your technology or technique be able to do that?
I think so, yes. If you label the virus and at the same time you label the nuclear pore complex, it should be possible to see how they correlate in space. Again, the only question is, and I'm not too much of an expert of that, so how well can you label the nuclear pore complexes under living conditions? Because these images here were under fixed conditions. But to my knowledge, there are colleagues out there who have made substantial progress along those lines, especially in this field of nuclear pore complex, including in my own institute, neighbors, colleagues. And so these new labeling methods that do not disturb the nuclear pore complex, they keep it functional, so to speak. They should be able to reveal how the basket opens and how these things go through and where it gets stuck if it gets stuck. And labeling a virus is per se not a big deal. There are many, many ways of labeling viruses.
Excellent.
So I think by concentrating on the problem, sorting out the labeling issue, and working patiently on it, it's possible, yes.
Okay, thank you.
But perhaps not that you go tomorrow and do it, but sorting out the labeling, and then yes.
Are there any other questions? Well, if not,
Okay.
once again, thank you very much,
you.
Professor Helsinki.